So thank you, Marina. Thank you, Dr. Moyo, for this really excellent setup and table setting for the conversations today. It is a beautiful morning. I'm sorry that those of you who are online can't see what a beautiful morning it is here in Stellenbosch. I was up, as Marina suggested, I was up at the crack of dawn today from my balcony bird watching, and I walked the grounds and did not see a soul, not one of you out looking at the birds with me, but I'll forgive you for that one. But in any event, good morning, guten Morgen, and I'm just delighted to see everybody here, both in the venue that we have. It's a great packed conference, and I know that some of you may have friends who were unable to get in because it was just such a popular conference, but I hope that both through the websites that we develop and the YouTube products that we develop and your own word of mouth, you'll be able to tell everybody just what an exciting time we had here over the next couple of days. It's also just terrific, I have to say, to be back here in South Africa. The last time I was here was about 2022. Let's see if I can do that. It was 2022, and you may or 2002. You may remember that that was the last time you had a total eclipse of the sun. And we came here for the Public Communication Science and Technology meeting held here in South Africa. It was terrific, and I made so many great relationships and colleagues here in South Africa, and I was always been excited to be back. And I didn't want to wait for the next one, which will be 2030. So maybe Marina will invite me back to see the next total eclipse in 2030. Now, I have to say that nothing focuses the mind like a total solar eclipse. It dominates the news cycle for months and weeks and sometimes even a year. It dominates school curricula from primary schools all the way up through college. And yet, viewing a total solar eclipse does nothing for you personally as far as utility is concerned. Unless you happen to be a hotel proprietor in the path of the totality, in which case you'd stand to make $1 million for being able to do that. But it doesn't provide a health benefit. It doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't stimulate a national economy. It doesn't pay your rent, and it doesn't pay your mortgage. It won't make goods or services cheaper. It won't bring down inflation, and it won't spin off new technologies for cheaper or more reliable energy. There we go. And of course, they're rare events. I mean, if I were going to wait to tell the story about a total solar eclipse from 2002, and I had to wait until 2030, I think I would have like several generations of students who would move through there and not ever having seen a total solar eclipse, except through the magic of some of the things that we take during those events. And in fact, all of these images are from the 2002 eclipse that was here in South Africa. But we can't always depend on these mega rare but very exciting events to help stimulate conversations around particularly basic science, the kinds of things that don't yield these immediate social applications that we find it so easy to write about. I too was a public information officer, communications officer for the better part of 40 years. Marina did the good thing and got out of it and got to do really academic and interesting stuff. I stayed in the field. And I have to tell you, it is really easy to write about the next new widget and not so easy to write about catalysts, not so easy to write about chemical reactions, not so easy to write about algorithms. I mean, mathematics are just, I call up the New York Times and say, one of our scientists just did this great new algorithm. Yeah. So, but that makes wonderful conversation at the dinner table. My relatives and the rest of my friends, they love to hear these stories. I'm going to pretend you guys love to hear these stories too, because I have a couple to tell you. But they are undeniably cool. All things being equal, they are undeniably cool. Now, every hero has an origin story. this is my origin story, and I'm going to think about the superhero piece of this here, because when you think about superheroes, mostly you don't know who they are. And I would just say, all of you in this room, as far as basic science is concerned, discovery science is concerned, every one of you in this room is a superhero. And every one of you has an origin story. But I wanted to share mine simply because there's an important understanding of why I am passionate about basic science. And I think we'll be able to unpack some of that, particularly with some of the conversations later on about why scientists do communication about basic science, why scientists get involved in these things in the first place. And we still want to be able to talk about basic science. We want to be able to be the superheroes about that. But before I move to sort of my own sort of background here, I just wanted to reinforce that the eclipses that we're talking about just as a model of communication for basic science and discovery science, they generate awe in addition to generating social media. They spark curiosity just as much as they spark curricula. They inspire wonder about our world, and they inspire wonder about our universe and our place in it. And this symposium is dedicated to the proposition that we can do the same things that we do for solar eclipses for all the kinds of discovery science that we do. We may not be as successful. We may have to struggle a little harder to figure out ways to make that conversation happen and to make those relationships and connections happen. But we can do that, and that's what this conversation today, the conversation in the journal, the conversation in the SciPep report, all of those will help us develop the conversational skills needed to be able to talk about discovery science. And I have great hope for this proposition because, as I said, I am a basic scientist as I started out. That was my career. In the most basic, I mean, if you're a mathematician, you'll dispute me on this. If you're a chemist, you'll probably dispute me on this. But if you're a biologist, the most fundamental thing you can do is taxonomy, which is, and systematics, how to name organisms, what their relationships to each other are. You're really just talking about, the family relationships between organisms. And Dr. Mukunga is going to talk about a much better conversation around taxonomy and plant taxonomy in particular. I have a very strong feeling for that because I was a botanist to begin with. But just because we have these questions around very abstract areas, she's going to do this terrific job of bringing that into our personal experience in the way that I was unable to do, and I'll tell you why that was the case. So, I decided in my youth, I had an undergraduate degree in biology, but I also loved writing. So I took an undergraduate degree in English. And I took minors in Latin, I took a minor in horticulture, I took another minor in traditional plant biology, and I loved all of it. And that will tell you everything you know, that for the last some odd years, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I still have this really hard, as everyone who's had to sit through breakfast with me here this morning or otherwise, I'm constantly talking about all the snakes that are here, all the birds that are here. I'm just so passionate about these things. But then I'm also passionate about how to communicate about them. And I'm also passionate about the policies that support them. I'm also passionate about the funding that makes these things happen. And I just want to be able to say that when I started out, I had a very narrow view of what basic science was. And I didn't realize that there was something different about basic science and the rest of science. To me, it was all science. I mean, I'm coming out of high school, I went to college, and I have these degrees, and I'm ready to go to graduate school, and I made applications to literature programs, I made applications to MFA programs and creative writing, and the best ride that I got from a university was a full scholarship to the University of Maryland. It also happened that I was about as far away from my home as I could get, so it's like, I am going to the University of Maryland, and I wanted to study spiders. I was so excited about spiders, let me tell you. I still am excited about spiders. In fact, you have a big huntsman spider here that feeds only on geckos. Just go talk about that at lunch. Just really cool things. And I was interested in their venom. I was interested in how you classify spiders because of the kinds of webs that they build. And I went to the University of Maryland, which had a program with the National History Museum in Washington and the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, and they had a couple of us in the first cohort for the Maryland Center for Systematic Entomology. I was so excited. I arrived last week of July. Our classes started in August. I met my graduate advisor, wonderful guy, wonderful old guy, and at the end of August he died. I know. I was devastated. I mean, we were studying all these really cool things. I'm sure his family was devastated too, but this was me. I mean, we're talking about me here. I was concerned about that. So there was hand-wringing in the faculty room. What are we going to do with Rick? He wanted to study spiders. There's nobody here who can direct his research. So they said, we'll have Rick study butterflies. Well, I had a little bit of background in butterflies there. I had done an honors program and as an undergraduate. I thought, oh, that's cool. And we were going to study the biogeography of butterflies in the Caribbean islands. And I'm thinking, I'll pack my hammock. I'll learn to drink all different kinds of rum because it's cheap and easy to drink rum in the island. I'm like, this is the graduate career that I wanted. I just think this is just marvelous. October, my graduate advisor died. Heart attack. Now, if you've been through a graduate program, you know that 2 strikes and you're almost out. So the faculty had this real concern. Well, what are we going to do about this clearly unlucky kid who is going to bring gloom and doom to whatever program we put him in? So they were clever people. So what did they do? They gave me the research of someone who was already dead. All I had to do was finish it up. That was my only job. I just had to finish it up. And they were leaf mining moths. So I want to tell you a little bit about leaf mining moths. They are really, really tiny moths. Okay, don't be a hard crowd for me. They're so small. How small? Thank you for asking. They're so small that you're thinking about these big caterpillars that are on your tomato plants and other plants. These big things you see. These are so small. They actually live between the upper and lower epidermis of leaves, and they're little miners. They mine out that little couple of cell layer thick area between the upper leaf and the lower leaf. Here's a couple of the ones I was looking at. The one in the big left corner there is called the chestnut sweeper. Most of them are named in England, so they have these really cool names. We name them stupid stuff, but blotch miner of oak. No, this is the chestnut sweeper. But the thing to notice about these things, and I didn't realize it when I signed on to this, the only way you can tell what kinds of these moths you have, these teeny moths are maybe, forgive me for the English metrics, 1/4 of an inch wingspread. The only way you can actually tell what they are is by dissecting out their genitalia, which, for English speakers among us, gives you a new meaning for the word mothballs. But this is what you see. This is what you see down here in the corner is a dissected out mothball. That you have to clear, you have to put in Clorox and clean it, and you ruin about 20 of these for every one that you get out, but that's the real way you can tell what they are. Well, there is nothing economically, there is nothing evolutionarily, there is nothing about these things that has any relevance to your life whatsoever. There is one species that might sometimes cause problems on apples. That's it. So how do you make these, how do I find money to study these things? First of all, that's the big issue, is if it's not relevant, how do you find money to do it? And it turns out that we had in the United States the Endangered Species Act. Gods know how long that will still happen, but we have the Endangered Species Act, and there was a leaf miner on chestnut. And for those of you who have followed botany of trees in particular, American chestnut was the dominant tree across most of eastern North America up until the early 1900s. when a fungus disease spread by a beetle was imported from Europe. Thank you, Europe. They were getting back at us for giving them phylloxera, which nearly wiped out their grape industry. So they gave us this chestnut blight. And there was one of my little leaf miners that fed on chestnut blight, and when the chestnuts all died, it was probably an endangered species. So there's my bid for relevance of leaf miners. You know, my friends love me talking about leaf miners. I think it's really cool. I have friends still who will, go out in the field and say, Rick told me that was there's a caterpillar in there. Can you believe that's really cool? Well, this particular leaf miner, the chestnut leaf miner, makes a very distinctive mine. That's the mine on my right. You're right, too. And that's the adult, the chestnut leaf miner. Well, it turns out I had like 2 years to work out what was going on with this leaf miner, and then my research would be over. And that would be a really good master's degree, right? Whoops. Let me go back. Because I will tell you, I solved this in 2 weeks because they didn't care. They jumped on oaks. They used just plain old oaks now. So you can find these things everywhere. And I no longer had a rationale for the relevance of tissue-reed leaf mining moths. Well, they took pity on me and sent me off as a curatorial assistant to the National Museum of Natural History. Some of you have probably been there in Washington, D.C. It's a wonderful old building. And I just want to point your attention to this dome here, because this dome is going to be important in my origin story. And I love this place. I thought I'm going to be working here. I'm going to be down, looking at this elephant every day. I mean, I'm coming back, I'm trying to find as many South African references as I can here. We're back to the elephants. We had these really terrific other collections that I was excited about, all the paleontology and all that kind of stuff. This is what I was going to be doing, and in fact, they have a just phenomenal collection of butterflies and moths. So that's what I was going to be working on, butterflies and moths, over the summer. And I'd finished up all my master's work, and I was sort of casting around for how to write a master's thesis on a 2-week discovery that this thing still existed. Well, that was not going to be a master's program. So they put me to work as a curatorial assistant, which I thought, this is really cool. We'll be able to do something really nice about that. And here's what I got instead. If you look on the right side of your screen, you'll see all these little paper triangles and all these dead butterflies laying on top of those paper triangles. Those were collected 30 years ago and have been in those paper triangles ever since. And what you want to do is get them to be able to study them and get them into the box, into the drawer, like you see them on the right. You'd think that was a straightforward proposition, wouldn't you? It is not a straightforward proposition. There was a whole team of graduate students and I were up in an un-air-conditioned garret in that dome in the middle of August, trying to figure these things out. And this is what you do. Every single one of these has to be put into a humidifier and softened up and then spread out and then dried out and then removed. And God help you if you break one of those antennae off, because your major advisor is going to come and yell at you. So I was damn good at this, I will tell you. All things being equal, I could have done this the rest of my life, but it was damn boring. Let me tell you, it was really boring. So what was I able to do in the meantime? Oh, and let me just back up and say that the collection that I was hired to do was a collection of South African moths and butterflies that had been collected in the early 1960s and had been in those pieces of paper, those paper triangles, in the decades ever since. I won't tell you how many decades, because that tells you how old I am, but there were a lot of decades there. So it's a hot summer. I'm sitting up there in the garret with a couple of other graduate students. We would wear strapless shirts because it was really hot up there, and then we had to put on real clothes when we went downstairs to see what was going on, but it was so hot. But we had ventilation ducts that came up from the actually air-conditioned pieces of the museum. And I had 2 ventilation ducts. I had one ventilation duct that came up from the insect zoo. which is a public sort of discovery area for insects. Now, this is the great irony because I study public affairs and advertising and marketing around science. It's now the Orkin Insect Zoo. Orkin is a major producer of pesticides to kill insects. So it's the Orkin Insect Zoo. And the conversations were just amazing because I could hear them coming up through the ventilation duct. And they were kids who would come in and they would be like, this is such a cool thing. Why does it have 6 legs? Case of an insect. Why does it have 8 legs in the case of the spiders? Why does it have 102 legs in the case of the centipedes and the millipedes? Does it bite? Does it sting? Is it poison? Why is it blue? Why is it yellow? Wonderful, wonderful questions. And then the other duct came up from the entomology chairman's office. And those were enlightening conversations in a different way. The conversations were all around, does this third nodal thoracic segment warrant superspecific or subspecific status? I'm not sure this resolves on the cladogram. And I'm just thinking, okay, 2 universes here about to collide in my overheated brain in the dome of the Natural History Museum. And here's the clash. I mean, here are the kids so excited. And then here are the scientists whose I swear were determined to squash all of that excitement. It was just, it was the clash of the titans in a real way. And I thought, and many of you have probably started out this way. I'm going to take a leap of faith and believe that all of you have moved past this and evolved. But I decided at that point in my career that all this was a translation problem. All I had to do was translate what those gray-haired people down in the entomology chairman's office were saying in ways the kids could understand. And I persisted in that belief for about 30 years. Many of our science communicators persist in that belief even today. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, I think, is going to have a good reflection on that. So I went at the end of August, I went back to my entomology chairman and I said, I'm done with mothballs. I'm done with moving insects from one box to another. I'm going to study science communication. And I was hired immediately by the university, and then the rest is history. 40 years later, I won't bore you with the rest of the 40 years because you've been in one federal PIO job, you've been in them all, you know what they're like. I switched places a lot because I always thought there would be an agency that was willing to take the risk and do the avant-garde science communication that I knew would be more effective. No. It just happens that almost every time, I'd make incremental increases and I get hired someone else, I make incremental increases in how we do our practice, and then another incremental increase. And then I gave up and spent 10 years at the Department of Energy, and we did wonderful things there, but it's because we had relatively good and interesting and engaged people who were interested in what we were doing in science communication, by which I mean they left us alone. And Allison may be able to tell you a little bit more about that because she is my successor there and is currently working in that environment. But 40 years later, and you'll see there's an important little graphic on the slide there that we'll talk about, there was SciPep. And, talk about a capstone for a career of communicating about science. SciPep really was and continues to be the gift that keeps on giving to our community of communicators about basic science. I'm not going to foreshadow or take the thunder for the folks who are doing the SciPep conversation after this, because they have so much to tell you about this, but I will just tell you that this was really critical, and we are just understanding how critical and informative and impactful this can be and will be if we just take the opportunity to do that. And then the special issue of the Journal of Communication came about as a reflection partly of SciPep, and partly as a response to that, the symposium. And this is a really critical piece that I want to express here. These are not 3 separate documents. And the reason you have them all in your little bag today is because you should have read them before you came in the room. That's one. Two, and I'm not going to give away too many spoilers, this is many times more research on basic science communication than existed 5 years ago. This is a down payment. This is not the end of everything. This is a down payment on a change in communication strategy for the community of basic science of communications. So in reality, for most of the time that I was working on this, we were all working under the same sort of received wisdom that to be a good science communicator, basic science or not, the first thing you have to do is figure out why is it relevant to your audience. And in fact, when I went into graduate school in journalism and science writing, and there was actually a formula. Your second paragraph always had to say, why is this important? And I'm like, well, it's not. So it's not really important. It's interesting. It's freaking cool. No. Everyone, the received wisdom, everyone would say that's not enough. You have to tell people why it's going to save their lives. You have to tell people why it's going to make their quality of life better. You have to do all these things to justify your expenditure about utility in science. And that's been the fundamental frame of how we have looked at science communication around basic science. We haven't made a distinction between basic science and discovery science and applied science and technology. We all think it's one size fits all, and we wanted to take a look at that, and that's what SciPep was all about, and that's how we were able to get to the point of generating the special issue of the journal and generating this particular symposium. But almost all the framing that we'd seen over those past 40 years had been around utility. What is this going to do for you? Most importantly, when we went to our policymakers and our funders, we would go to them and they would say, what is this doing for us? And rather than have the conversation with them that says, basic science is about discovery and awe and inspiration, we let ourselves, as a community, and I'll take full responsibility of this because most of my career has been in advocating for federal funding and federal science, we let them paint us into the corner that we all always had to come back and say, oh, in 2 years we're going to do this. Oh, in 2 years, it will lead to a cure for this. It will lead to a really cheap way of doing this. It will lead to this new technology. And we perjured ourselves many times in doing that. And I think that's been a real damage to the scientific credibility, and one of the reasons why scientific credibility has taken a hit in many of the Western countries is because we make these promises. We know we're not going to keep them. We pray that the person we made them to will not be elected next time, so we don't have to make good on our promise. But we also want to make sure that we hype this enough to get people to pay for it. This is a very difficult and toxic situation for the funding of basic science and discovery science. So the journal then came about as a consequence of many of the conversations that we had at SciPep about the fact that there was no research, no best practices analysis, no thought leadership around discovery science. And was there any difference between how we communicate about discovery science than there was about applied science and technology? And there'll be a lot of conversation about that in the next session. And I'll just leave it here in saying I was hopeful that there would be major differences, and there'll be a lot to unpack for us a little bit today. So the program today was heavily informed by our putting that journal together. And there are a couple of things that I think are very important for us to understand about the documents that you have in front of us. Most about what we did not do. But I will say that we had, in both instances, both for this symposium and for the journal, we had many more submissions than we could ever touch. We could never use them all. Even Kavli's money is limited, is not infinite. And so we could probably have gone hunting more and more. But in fact, there still was not a lot of work out there. And it wasn't hard to put this issue together, but it was hard to find the really critical pieces that would help us turn the page in conversations in the broader scientific community about this. We didn't try well, actually, we tried and failed many times to decide what basic science was and discovery science was, and what discovery science communication was, as opposed to what other kinds of science communication were. I think we've got to a good place about that conversation, but we never saw it as our remit, as really finding that bright line. And I think that would be a mistake for us to try to decide what bright lines exist here, because there are other ways for us to frame that. But we were looking about how to frame the communications issues here about discovery science and identifying connections and curiosity, in addition to the utility and relevance conversations we're always having about science communication. And we were looking at ways about, if we're going to do a narrative about applied science or technology, how do you back into that? How do you also talk about discovery science and how important discovery was in the bringing of this social good to the public that has funded your research? And I think those are different kinds of ways that one can approach this business of discovery science communication. And lastly, we wanted to look at how science, both practices and research and scholarship, could tap into a rich social sciences research base that is there, even if it wasn't directly associated with the work that we were doing. And that's where we found that there is just a tremendous amount of stuff for us to find, and a lot of that stuff is going to be unpacked for you today in the symposium. Now, I just want to make it very clear, there are broad conversations about science communication, important, weighty, incredible conversations that are profoundly world-changing, mostly about applied and technology research. We are not suggesting we walk away from that. We are suggesting, however, that there's more to this than meets the eye. There's more that we can do. And I think the more that we can do has to do with the ability of us to understand that different people respond differently to different kinds of messaging. Different science lends itself better to different kinds of messaging, and we have yet to explore even the beginnings of the full richness that's out there to be able to, for us to use for discovery science communication. And there's plenty, I swear, plenty of fodder for those discussions in the next 3 days. What I will say, I think, backing up here, is in the conversations today and tomorrow and Wednesday, you'll have some thought-provoking philosophical pieces that I think are really important. Don't just snooze through those and wait for the really interesting breakthrough kinds of things that we're doing. Always take a look at and listen to those sort of understanding and context-laden pieces of things. And where possible, we've taken the best practices pieces and grouped them together in sort of similar areas. For example, there's a discussion about South African initiatives in particular, which is just really fascinating to me. But we've mostly packed those into the breakout sessions, so we'll be able to see those. The plenary sessions, I think, are also really good, and they'll end up back in the same place we started, which is taking a look at what the social sciences can do for us and how we then be able to take these basic science, discovery science conversations and take them into a larger social space. Now, I hope that this work here in the journal, in SciPep, and that of my colleagues at Kavli who are continuing to work on this, and the Department of Energy who are continuing to work on this, at Stellenbosch University, at the journal, at JCOM, and with my editorial group. I have to really give great shout outs for my editorial committee and scientific committee, will mark a real pivot point in our conversations around science communication more broadly. And I encourage each of you, in addition to reading these pieces over your breaks, don't go making relationships, read these damn papers. And ensure that discovery science is an integral part of the conversations going forward in the larger conversation about science communication. There is so much more to learn and to practice, And I'm looking forward to hearing about it, not from the papers, but from you guys over the next 3 days. I thank you very much, and I look forward to all the great things that you're going to be providing me, and I'll just flop up my last 2 slides of acknowledgments, because this is not everybody who helped me, but these are the people who really, really stood out for me on the acknowledgments for the generic side, and then my editorial committee. And if my editorial committee people are here, please stand up. I see Marina, I see Sarah, yes, and here's Jeannie, and I suspect our others are online watching us. And I just think this has been a terrific opportunity for us to unpack so many of these things, and I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to do that. Thank you.